words about VA Bio.
Hello, thank you to everyone for joining today. I'll keep it brief because Willie has a much better accent than I have and no one wants to listen to me today. I'm Ron Trumbo, like Willie said. I am the VP of Operations here at Virginia Bio. As you may know, Virginia Bio received a Go Virginia grant that allows us to do the Virginia Bio Connect program that allows for funding for a lot of these fun projects, including the life science mentors. We're very, very, very fortunate to have it and are so excited about all of the things that we get to do within the state to help the life science industry because of it. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions about things going on at Virginia Bio. Virginia Bio Connect does have the first life science career fair coming up on October 5th, both here in Richmond in person as well as hybrid. So, feel free to come and join that. We want to get everybody employed in Virginia and keep them in Virginia. And I think that's it for me. So feel free to send us any questions you have and enjoy hearing from Willie today. He's the best.
That cost me a lot of money, but thank you for the compliment. Now, actually would like to introduce our host for today, and it's from Activation Capital, and it's Heather Allen. Thanks.
Hi, welcome guys. I just want to say how excited we are to host this today. We're so glad that Willie is here, and we're also glad that you're joining us online and in person. A little bit about Activation Capital. You might have heard our name in the news recently, tied to an EDA, one of those 21 finalists. But what we do here is we grow Virginia's community of advanced tech entrepreneurs, and we empower them to solve the world's toughest problems. So please go and check us out. Activation.capital is our website. We do have events as well. We do some things here with Virginia Bio and other entities as well, but check us out, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you.
Okay. One more introduction to go, and this is actually to introduce Josh Green, who's the director of the ICAP program, and who's going to say, I think, a few words about what ICAP is and also its association with SBDC. So over to you, Josh.
All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon again, everybody. I am the director of ICAP, the Innovation Commercialization Assistant Program, and we work with Virginia-based tech and innovation-driven startups over the long term of their venture. So from ideation all the way through multiple rounds of funding, as well as everything in between. We are part of the Virginia Small Business Development Center Network, which is a partnership between the U.S. Small Business Administration and George Mason University, along with local host institutions. We have 27 centers across Virginia, and we focus on training and technical assistance for small businesses and startups. For ICAP specifically, beyond the life science team that William mentioned, we have over 15 mentors who are throughout the Commonwealth and have a wide variety of backgrounds and tech industries that they come from. The services that we provide are offered at no charge, and our goal is to help you be successful. And with that, I won't delay it any longer. I'm very much looking forward to having William present on customer discovery and what that means for longer term ventures. So William, I will pass it back over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Josh, and Karen, and also Heather, and to the audience here in the tech park. So today I'm going to talk, as Josh mentioned. Let me just advance the slide a bit. Today I'm going to talk to you about something from my background, which is in the drug discovery, but we're going to make it apply to other types of projects where the time from idea all the way through to, say, getting regulatory approval, can be anywhere in the region of 5 to 15 or more years. And for that type of longer term activity, then what are the important things to consider about customer discovery? what I hope to convince you is that consideration of time in the future is one of the key things that one has to do. And as I mentioned, me being a life science business mentor, I am going to focus on healthcare products, and there will be a little bit of a bias towards drug discovery, but as I mentioned, I will do my best to make it a bit more broadly applicable. So what are we, sorry, I'm just shifting this out the way so we can see the slide. So the types of healthcare products that we're considering here are things like new drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, medical devices, and also more and more these days, apps. The general flow, as you can see, I think on this slide, is there's some preclinical type of activity. Then there's the clinical testing. FDA gives its stamp of approval. One goes to market with some customer discovery activity. The customers are usually jumping up and down in this screen, but they're not doing that today. But these are happy customers with the new product. And of course, the investors and founders and employees of the company are also very happy with the success. So that's the general type of flow here that we're going to consider. So I guess one question that most people might ask is, do we actually need customer discovery in a healthcare product? Isn't it obvious who the customer is, what the problem is, what the solution is, especially if the FDA has approved it? What I will hope to convince you is that the answer to that is no, it's not obvious. And especially not if one takes into account that factor of time, the time from going from the preclinical ideas through the clinical trial phase, which themselves can be anything from, say, 3 to 8 or more years, and then on through to the market. So that time aspect to it means that many things can change over that time that will impact on your customer discovery activities and have implications for the actual product that you should be making when it comes to the time to release to the market at launch. Oh, now they're all moving. Now they're happy. Okay, so I can't see so many folk. I was going to ask if you, how many people actually have done some customer discovery activity. Oh, 2/3, well, 1/3, oh, 2/3 of the audience here have done. So that's great. So, and then but for those who maybe haven't done this, it's really around the problem solution fit. The first step is that we identify a customer segment, and I'll define a bit more in the next slide what is a customer segment. Having identified the customer segment, then we have to decide what the actual main problem is that that segment needs to have solved, the really urgent problem that they want to have solved. Having identified that, we then match their problem to a solution, which hopefully is our product. But critical to this is that it has to bring value to the customer. And once you have all of these things lined up, then again, we're back to having the happy customers and on the road to a successful product. So what is a customer segment? One way to define this is that it's a distinct group of people who share certain parameters. That could be age, it could be geography, it could be likes or dislikes, it can be a whole variety of things, but that share a set of traits relevant to some dimension of your proposed solution. I wanted to translate that into something like a healthcare example. So one could think that a segment here might be a group of patients who share a definable set of disease symptoms and underlying causes of the disease, and that the segment, it may often fall within a particular definable age range, and it may sometimes only contain one gender. But that would be some type of example of what is a customer segment in the context of healthcare. Excuse me. So when do we do customer discovery? These are just some possibilities. I will ask the audience here as soon as I can actually hear them. When would we do customer discovery? Do we wait till we get ready to go on the market to find out that what is the problem solution fit, or do we do it very early, say before we have the minimal viable product, the MVP? Kind of obvious, I guess. They're all saying early, and that's right. Yeah, we would do it early, right? Ideally, right at the outset of this activity. And indeed, some of the teams that I talk with through the ICAP program, they are very early in this process, maybe even still actually at the idea stage. But doing this type of questioning and then interviewing of having identified a customer segment, talking to them, interviewing them to find out what their problem is very valuable to help direct the actual nature of the product that's needed, and perhaps even if the business idea is viable or not. But I'm going to keep adding in the concept of time, because I want you to bear in mind we're talking about long-term projects. So what if it does take 5 or 15 years to go through this whole process and get onto the market? Is the customer discovery activity that we've done 5 or 15 years ago relevant again today? Or if we did it today, is it relevant in 5 or 15 years from now? I guess you might be thinking, but I don't need to go 5 or 15 years. I'm going to sell off my product, or I'm going to exit somehow. Absolutely true. But the people that are buying it are going to want to know, is this something that is going to be successful? Have you thought about your customer and your market at the time of launch? And if you take the kind of topic I'm thinking of, which is something around medical devices or perhaps new drugs, once you're into the clinical trial phase, your potential product's locked in. And so for all the time that you're going through the clinical trials, which might be 5 or 8 years, you're not changing that product. That's what you're testing. Does that product work or not? So really, you want to be absolutely sure. And that part is relevant because it's typically within the clinical trial phase, maybe at phase 2, that you'll get companies interested in licensing or buying you. But that's where your product is locked in. So you have to have thought in advance, what is it that I need to have at the time of market to then start building through your product. Okay, so in healthcare, so specifically then in drug discovery, which is what I did for a living for 25 years. This is, we actually do apply these very principles. When we are starting a new project, we don't start back here with our favorite target from the literature. We start up at this other end where the clinical need is, and we go and talk to patients and we go and talk to doctors for the specific indication that we're considering. And we ask them, what do they see as the current need and the current gap? And then in addition to that, bearing in mind this time scale, we also want to try and have some handle on what will the healthcare environment look like when we get to launch, because that's really the critical point of time here. And that is what we would do by way of our customer discovery, having identified the problem or the gap, the need. To get the solution, then we're looking to see, and we also know what it is that we need to deliver at the time of launch. So what type of outcome is it that we want? Then we go back and pick, okay, what target do we think is actually molecular target is actually going to let us get a new drug that in 8 years or 15 years time will actually deliver those outputs. A very different way around from, as I said, taking your favorite receptor from your research studies and then going and trying to turn it into a new drug. So we do actually apply these very principles. So I'm just going to keep hammering on this message. The surest way to fail with a healthcare product is to build and market a solution that your customer does not need when it comes to the time of launch. And bear in mind that it may well have been something they thought they were going to need when you set out on this journey, but life changes, time moves on. So you have to ensure your healthcare product customer discovery is time relevant. I feel like I'm getting through this ultra fast. Time's moving very fast. Okay, so again, I just want to hit on this thing, and I'm going to emphasize a point or two that with an example that I should actually have mentioned a bit earlier in the talk. This thing that I mentioned earlier about, isn't it obvious? You know, who's the customer? Well, isn't it the doctor? Because they're the one that's going to prescribe the medicine. So are they not the customer? Isn't it obvious what the problem is? Looking at treating a particular cancer, particular tumor. Isn't it obvious? What I want to do is either cure that or prolong life or maybe improve quality of life. And isn't it obvious what the solution is? We have this wonder drug and it's going to be wonderful in the clinical trials. It worked to treat in the animal models and the FDA are going to approve it. So there we go. Isn't it all obvious? Why do we need to do all this customer discovery? Well, because it's not obvious, right? And I'll show you in the next slide that, for example, the customer environment is complicated. Just take the doctor, for example. In the case of oncology, frequently it's a tumor panel that takes decisions on what the treatment is. So it's not just one doctor. Then there's also the question of the problem. So I have a tumor, but what stage is that tumor at? Is it early? Is it late? What's the prognosis for this, for survival? If you say, tell me, you can prolong my life by 12 months, that might sound great. But on the other hand, it might come at a cost of poor quality of life from the side effects, which is very common in oncology products. And that balance is very important, actually, to both doctors and patients. So it's not uncommon that they would say, you know, I would rather have a better quality of life than an extra 12 months. That might seem harsh to you, but that is actually messages that I know that we have heard when we've done this type of stuff in our company, and also when we've been talking actually to some of the companies that we've been interacting with through ICAP. So right there, it's not straightforward, nor is it straightforward that the FDA approval is going to guarantee you market success. That's not what they are doing. They're saying that based on what you told them this compound would do in the trial, it's met that goal. That's very different from saying that that's going to be something that's marketable and a success out on the market. So it's actually not obvious, really. And one has to think very carefully about these things, even in this context of, or particularly actually in this context of healthcare. So yes, let's consider a little bit more now the players in the healthcare product ecosystem. For those of you who have been through a program like ICOR or indeed ICAP, you may well recognize this slide as being the interaction of the players within the buyer ecosystem. Going from the user at one end, in the context of this, we could imagine that the user is the actual patient, the recipient of the product. The influencer, I'll just say here, we talked about maybe being social media as one example of an influencer. on, and perhaps patient support groups for particular diseases, they can have an influence on what type of new medication would be needed. The doctor, in terms of the actual treatment, the doctor is, yes, they're making the recommendation, but as I indicated to you, they're not the only individual involved in that decision. Then we actually have the decision maker. So we also have now to introduce the health insurance company as being a key component of that decision-making process based on what are they going to be prepared to pay for. And I guess, no, I'll come to that other point in a moment. I also have the doctor here because yes, they do take decisions through the panel on what treatment they would recommend, but the patient doesn't have treatment forced on them. The patient can decide whether or not they want to go down that route. So the patient is also part of the decision-making process here. Then we come to the actual, who's actually buying this. I guess ultimately, possibly the patient through health insurance or just by themselves, but it's some combination of insurance company and patient that is actually paying out the money. For those who do know, again, about customer discovery process and have seen this diagram before, the last person to consider here is what's known as a saboteur. So somebody who's trying to disrupt this decision-making process to buy or use a particular treatment. In this case, we thought what might be an example, and we came up with two options here. One might be misinformation on social media about the benefits or side effects of particular treatments. Another one, which might be a bit inflammatory to some people, but not all doctors are flexible in their decision-making about, based on perhaps many years' experience, they think that they do not want to go down a particular treatment route. But I hope you can understand from this that it's actually quite a complex picture here for the healthcare products about who is the customer in this. And everything I've just said, if you do your customer discovery today for a new project, you have this picture. All of these elements can change when it actually comes to the time of launch. Again, in an oncology project, you could more likely be at the 8 to 10 year end of the scale and not as long out as 15 or 20 years, but which is usually more cardiovascular diseases. But the you'd be looking probably at least at 8 years for this time scale for an oncology product. Then, just to remind you again, this part about the FDA, and about the product. So is it not just sufficient that the FDA says this product works and then off we go to the customers and the patients and everybody's happy? And as I indicated to you, no, that's not the case. It is no guarantee of commercial success. As I know, some of you may or may not know that so I'm not from the US, as maybe Karen indicated from my accent, but certainly in the UK, the government has an entity known as NICE, which actually for a new medicine, take a decision on whether it should be allowed to be sold based on a cost benefit analysis. And there have been some new drugs that they said no, the cost was too much for the benefit, or the benefit was too little to justify the cost. So there was some negotiation and reassessment. So that is a reality as well, this matter of, are you going to deliver sufficient benefit at the time of launch? Okay, so let's consider the timeline and also start to consider the future. And how might we predict the future? Which would be wonderful if you could predict the lottery winning numbers, but that's maybe not where we're going with this. So the timelines. These are my best guess of a range of timelines for different types of healthcare product. For an app, I think the actual process of turning the idea into some code and something that's maybe on a computer or iPhone, that actual process is fairly quick. I've made a ballpark figure of 6 months to a year. Of course, it might take a bit longer if you start to add in, like we need to get investment and so on, but fairly quick. A diagnostic, and I need to qualify here that if I was to think of a new antibody diagnostic, or perhaps a new DNA diagnostic, you could maybe think about the recent COVID experience and how quickly they were able to produce a diagnostic, but it still took between 1 to 2 years to do and get the necessary data together to show that it is actually diagnosing in a sufficient, sensitive and selective way to let it be usable, but it's still fairly quick. Medical device, it depends exactly what kind of device you're talking about here, if it's a surgical device or some perhaps a monitoring device or perhaps a drug delivery device. But a typical timescale here is something in the 3 to 8 year range. Now we're getting into the kind of range of time that has an impact on your customer discovery activity. And for a new drug, to go all the way from starting a project that you have your idea of what you want to do, start the project and get at the other end your FDA approval. That can be anything 8 to 20 years. As I said, the shorter time, the 8 years, that's typically oncology. Infection can also be quite fairly quick. The 20-year time point, that's really thinking more cardiovascular and where they're requiring endpoints like reduced mortality, for example. And a rough average time is around about 10 years. So I'm just putting some numbers up there for years. So, you know, if you start your healthcare product journey today, you're looking at 2030, around about there for a medical device, and out to somewhere between 2030 and 2042 for if it's a new drug that you're looking at. I just want to mention here again that this is the total time we're talking about from new drug to FDA approval. It won't be that length of time if you're thinking about exiting. It will, of course, be a bit shorter. But bear in mind what I said about once you enter the clinical trials, your product's fixed at that point, and it's either succeeds or it doesn't succeed, but you don't get to change the drug in the middle of the trial. Excuse me. Yeah, so this is just emphasizing this about a new product. You have to think quite far out in the future. And yeah, I mentioned when we had just talking about the customer segment that for the healthcare, it's not uncommon that you're looking at a population perhaps over 60, or you might be looking at one in the 40-60 age, or you might be looking at one in the younger age range. But I just want to take the 40 to 60 as an example. So now we're talking about a new drug. You do your customer discovery today, and your age range for the segments 40 to 60, that has a certain profile. But by the time you launch, right, it might be, say, 10 to 15 years later, the population that's 40 to 60 years old at that time is very different from the population that you did now. So you've done customer discovery on one type of population at the start, but it's not the population profile that might be there when you get to the end of the time to go onto the market. So it's one, I hope this is just another way to emphasize to you about the need to look at the future So I thought I would put in a quote to you from C.S. Lewis, who was I'm sure you all know, the author of Alice in Wonderland or Alice Through the Looking Glass. And this is a Cheshire Cat up here. The quote from C.S. Lewis was, "Isn't it funny how day by day nothing changes, but when you look back, everything's different?" And I see a lot of nodding heads. So I guess we all recognize that sentiment. So what about looking to the future then, instead of looking back? Here's a little cartoon that I found that I quite liked. So two people talking about the future. One says it will be great, the other says it will be awful. And the future says, "I don't care what you think. You don't know what the future is going to be. You don't know what I know." Okay, so thinking about the future, right? That's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah, it's because you have to imagine what you can't imagine. That's the fundamental of it. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. And I want to take an example. When I click on this, it will probably start. But if you put yourself back in the year 2000, would you have imagined this next set of things that would have launched within a few years? So we have Skype, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, iPhone, Tesla, an iPad. All of these launched within a fairly short period of time from the year 2000. If you look back now, it's all very different, but we're so used to these now, they've become part of everyone's daily life. But back in the year 2000, if you were having a discussion about what's going to be the next technology that's going to come along, would you have picked any of those? And possibly not. I think back in the year 2000, I was still using acetate sheets and pens for making presentations, and I'm seeing more nodding heads as well. So yeah, it's very hard to imagine the change that might happen. And that is the inherent problem in trying to look at the future. So what I'm going to talk about now is actually an example that I was part of within AstraZeneca, where we were asked to look in the future. And I co-led this activity with a guy called Jeff Walters, who was from the marketing side, and it was a fascinating activity to go through. So I'm going to walk you through it a little bit, not just to show that you can put a process on to try and get a handle on which direction the future is going to be, but also I'm going to use this example to talk about things that can change over that period of time. So in our particular case, I was working in the cardiovascular disease activity, I guess, in AstraZeneca, specifically in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the plaques that form in your arteries, and that if they rupture, you'll have a heart attack. And this was back in 2011, and we were asked to consider out 20 years, what might the healthcare environment look like in the year 2030? That being the kind of timeline that we would expect for a new product in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease to go from start project to get FDA approval. So we were asked to explore the future, consider possible future scenarios, and strategically plan accordingly. Simple, yeah. So what we did was, first of all, let me just give you a quick bit of background. So the background to this was, at that point in time, 2011, prevention of cardiovascular events had actually improved quite considerably over the previous 20, 30 years due to new, like statins, reducing cholesterol, better agents to control blood pressure, being able to inhibit clot formation. So there had already been an improvement in cardiovascular events. Healthcare providers were of the opinion, we knew this, that they thought that low patient compliance, so not taking the pills or not taking them the way they were intended to be taken, and that included the number of pills that people were on. An individual can be on a very large number of pills at the one time, and that creates a problem for individuals. So compliance was as much a problem to the occurrence of cardiovascular events, the ongoing occurrence, as it was a lack of new medicines. So they were thinking, we don't really need more medicines, that what we really need is improve compliance. And if we add in another pill into the already big pill burden, that might not be a good thing. So that was the background. Within the area, that ACVD area, we were fairly certain that yes, one could find new ways to attack, new mechanisms to attack that would be very effective and that would complement these existing medicines, and that we would have a good effect on reducing even more cardiovascular events. But commercial success of that would mean convincing physicians and payers. So if we start a new project now, what might be the future environment with respect to ACVD that we would be launching into? That was the task and the background. The 2 steps that we went through to do this were, number 1, to identify a set of drivers that might change what was happening in the future for treating atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And so that step involved, well, I'll come on to that in the next slide, sorry. The second step was, having identified a number of drivers, that we would then use those drivers to describe alternative possible future worlds. We actually were asked to come up with 4 possible future worlds. And then critically important is, having done that, you then have to identify a set of steps that you can monitor, things that might happen if the world is going to go from this direction today to that type of future over there. What might be the things that you would see happening over a period of time, and that could be monitored. So that was the process that we used to try and get a handle on the future. So the first step was this about identifying a set of drivers. So this was our kind of customer discovery. If you took each of these as being a equivalent of a customer segment, we talked to very large number of individuals in total. These included internal stakeholders in the company, health tech experts, scientists and clinicians who were at the kind of leading edge of new treatments for atherosclerosis, physicians themselves, and health policy experts, and also people from the health insurance side. So a lot of people we spoke to. We analysed and synthesized all of that information and identified actually 14 different drivers. And to prioritize these, we did one of these classic charts of, here we have level of impact on the y-axis, level of certainty on the x-axis, and we made our best guess where each of these 14 would lie. I'm not going to tell you at all about all of these 14. I'm just going to point out 3 of them. This light blue one, implications of atherosclerosis beyond events, so things that might impact on work or various other events beyond just the actual cardiovascular event itself. That underpinned everything else. We felt that was the kind of fundamental consideration. And then there were these other 2, ability to stratify patients and increased accountability and ownership of the problem by the patients themselves as being 2 other key drivers that we'd actually use to describe the worlds. You'll note that we had we were picking these from something that was fairly high level of impact, but in the middle for our level of certainty on whether these would be real drivers or not in the future. So what worlds did we get? Well, if we take the ability to stratify patients, and then we have at one extreme than now, which was 2011, that over the next 20 years, there might be no change in the ability to stratify patients. This was actually done at that time primarily by measuring the level of your LDL cholesterol in your blood. That was really the only way available at that point in time to say somebody was at high risk or not of having a cardiovascular event. But if you imagine that over that 20-year period of time, actually things improved dramatically and you were able to stratify patients to more precisely out of 10 people, that which 5 of them actually were the 5 that had a high risk of having a cardiovascular event, or perhaps down to the individual level, actually put a number on somebody's actual risk for an event. If that was the case, that's the other extreme over this 20 years. On the y-axis, we used that other driver, the one about increased ownership. So the way things were then, that it was largely down to governments deciding what, and health insurers, healthcare providers, what they were willing to pay for, which means what outcomes were they willing to pay for. And if that changed over the 20 years to actually patients had become more informed and were also more willing to pay a higher proportion of the cost for treatments that would treat an endpoint they wanted, which might be very different from the ones that the government and health insurers were willing to pay for. So with these two axes, we end up with 4 worlds. And I'll just mention the bottom left one is, by definition, nothing had changed over a 20-year period. Still couldn't stratify patients. The responsibility for the decisions on what treatments would be covered was still with the governments or the health insurers. And what they wanted primarily were hard endpoints like reduction in mortality. If nothing was going to change over the next 20 years, there was very little motivation for us as a company to think about new targets or products in that atherosclerosis area. If nothing was going to change, then there was really very little motivation to look for new products. I'll bring up these two. I'm not really going to mention them much, but here obviously there's still no change and you can't stratify patients, but patients are willing to pay more for the medication, the new medication. So you might be able to think about what would be a patient-centric endpoint, but you still can't really decide who it needs to be given to. And down here, you can stratify very well. So you can actually get subsegments that you know that they're going to have a particular risk of having an event. So you have different mechanisms you can look at, but it's still the healthcare providers and governments that are deciding what is the endpoint they need. So the best possibility would be if both of these changed. So you can stratify patients, you can quite precisely define their risk of an event, and there are also the types of events that you might want to be able to consider for a new drug would have increased substantially because it's the patient saying, I want this type of event. I'll make something up. It might be that they can walk an extra mile or something, but they can do something that was not an outcome that the governments or health insurers were willing to pay for previously. So this becomes up above this orange line. That's what we call patient-centric endpoints. And to the right of the green line, then you've got you've got a much better ability to stratify patients. So I said critically to go with that. That's all very well, but you have to know over the 20 years, okay, which way is the future looking like it's going to go? And so for each of those 4 worlds, we came up with a set of triggers or signals that in our view, if we saw these over this time scale, then things might indicate that the future is moving towards one or more of these future worlds. This is I'll just show 2 quickly. This is the one from that bottom left corner where nothing had changed. So if nothing changed, maybe for one example, which actually I don't know about here in the US, but certainly in bits of Europe, there was discussions about increasing taxation on unhealthy foods. But some of the other things that we had down here, I would say we haven't actually seen those coming in yet. If I look at the triggers and examples for where both of these drivers had changed, actually, to my view, quite a few of these we are actually starting to see. So over the, say, the 10-year period from 2011 to roughly speaking now, there is a much clearer link of atherosclerosis to cardiovascular events. Electronic medical records are coming in more, certainly more universally in the US and a bit more globally too. The cost of genome sequencing has dropped substantially, and genome sequencing needing to give you a genetic signal that says you have this type of risk for a cardiovascular event becomes possible and doable by both cost and numbers of people. Yeah, a lot more partnerships between pharma and data companies and diagnostic companies. Over the longer term, I think I would say some of these things are starting to come in. Routine genome sequencing is starting to appear. Telemedicine has increased a lot. And some of these, albeit, yes, precipitated by COVID, but it's becoming much more common. So this is not to say definitively the future is moving in that wonderful direction, but it's certainly moving away from where it was back in 2011. And yes, we did take some strategic decisions in the cardiovascular area based on the set of information when we presented to the cardiovascular management. And having taken that decision, and before they could implement this monitoring set, there was another reorganization and it was put on hold. There we go. That was a sad end to what was actually a really fun activity. But I hope I can convince you that you can put a process on to try and see where the future is going. So I'm going to finish with just a couple of quickish examples to illustrate, again, what types of changes might happen then that impact on the time aspect of customer discovery. So again, just bearing in mind that it's this customer discovery is matching a customer segment problem to a solution that brings a particular value. Thinking about segmenting patients, I'll bring up if you remember, that's that orange line that you either can or you can't do that. If you can stratify, the problem, at least in cardiovascular area, was that the treatment that was being given wasn't going to be one that would work for everyone, that was considered to be at risk based on LDL levels. The treatment that was being given might not work on everyone. So that had, it wasn't good for the patients because then not everybody's going to respond. It also isn't good from the practical side of if you're not going to be effective in everyone, the efficacy levels that you see is going to be lower than it might be. But if you can stratify them and more precisely define a subsegment of individuals who would respond to the treatment, then you can target them. And not only can you target that group of patients, but you can now start to think maybe of different types of way to treat that disease by target it to this particular group of patients. I think in the oncology area, one example might be the mutation in the EGF receptor. And if I get the name right, it's Tagrisso that targets that mutated receptor. And if you don't have that, that's for breast cancer. And if you don't have that mutation, that medicine's not for you. But if you do have the mutation, you can use this medicine. Take it to its extreme, you can have personalized risk and segmentation of being personalized. Yeah. So what this shows, though, is that by being able to segment patients through having some type of marker, be it a specific biomarker or be it a genetic profile, you open up a different set of solutions to the problem, and you open up a more defined type of customer segment. If we go back to this, I wanted to put this one up because, as I hope I indicated, if the world is moving from bottom left to top right, you are also opening up a different set of outcomes that you could look at, not just the ones that are required by the health insurers. And you also, at the same time, have done this ability to stratify. So you've impacted on who the customer segment is, what the problem is they want solved, therefore what the solution is, and you're also then impacting on the value to them. Of course, they would like to survive, of course, but there are other outputs that they would like to have that are opening up as possibilities. So that's consideration of how the future might be looking at the time you're launching has this really big impact on all of these factors in the customer discovery process. Just 3 slides to go, the last of which is some take-home points. So I'm going to, let me go back. I'm going to give you one specific, not example, it's not a real example, it's my personal hypothetical example of one way one could see the future happening based on things that are already in existence or FDA approved. So physician consults with the patients, puts the data into computer, the AI gives you back to the doctor a set of options and diagnosis. That does happen with, for example, the image analysis to do with certain conditions. Electronic health records, like you said, they're coming in more and more. Sequencing genotypes has become common, I would say, in many of the clinical trials that are on the go. So these are things that are actually happening. So then the physician selects the optimal drug and dose for the patient. Patient takes a prescription, goes to Walgreens and gets it pills 3D printed. They include a radio tracer so that you can monitor the compliance they did actually take the tablet if it's been given orally, and then connected devices record and monitor the patient's progress. There was a 3D printed pill, FDA approved, 2015. There has been trials done on digital pills. That was actually with AbbVie initially in the area of schizophrenia. Connected devices, you all know that. Probably many people have the, what do you call it, the Fit or the iWatch. So to me, this is maybe a bit far-fetched, but not that far-fetched, and would clearly, I think, have an impact on a whole variety of factors. And I saw this cartoon that I kind of liked. It says, the doctor talking to the patient, "I have no idea what's wrong with you. I just collect information, my computer makes the decisions." It may or may not be a world that future that you like, but I think it's a possibility. So, just to mention, I've been talking about time and impact on customer discovery, but of course, competitor products and how they evolve are a key impact over this time span on that, what do you need to be able to deliver at the time of getting to market. Changes in the regulatory system, I think we're already seeing some of that happening. Again, partly through COVID, but it's certainly more coming in more. And perhaps also changes in investors and the risk that they're willing to take. I would say the profile of the investors might even be changing. Maybe a lot more younger investors, maybe even more investment companies run and founded by women, for example. And the amount of money that's available and ways to finance. There's a lot of things changing that one also needs to keep an eye on in terms of and its impact on the customer discovery activities. So the very last slide, I don't have a clock, so sorry, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but okay. So the very last slide, just to take home messages, right? That what you need to consider for longer term healthcare ventures is the healthcare and society environment that you will be launching into, however far in the future that is. That's really the ultimate important point here. Who will be your customer segment at that time of launch may have changed dramatically or significantly from what it was at the outset, and the value that your product needs to deliver. That may well change depending on which direction the future worlds go. I'm not saying, by the way, that one should replicate what we did for that, looking at the future worlds, but it's just to give you that you can put a structure on it to try and get a handle. And then, of course, monitor for regulatory environment and investor approach. And ultimately, just be sure to keep your customer discovery data time relevant. So I'm going to stop there, and I would welcome any questions, that we can have a general discussion with me here and with the colleagues in the audience, and then we'll be moving into the breakout rooms. So thank you.
Thank you, Willie. I will let you know if there's any questions in the chat.
Thank you. So
for a startup in drug discovery development, we're small and we know how much we can go this process. But when we start writing grants or proposals, how we define our customer, because it can well be a big pharma at end of phase 2 clinical. And perhaps we don't have all the time horizon to forecast what is going to be at the time of launch for patient.
right.
So your comments.
So the question was, I'll just try and repeat the question. So the question was, for a startup company, small with, I guess, small resources and writing grants, how far down that thinking process should you go, or should you go at all down the process for thinking about the future, if perhaps the intent is to exit, I guess, somewhere in the clinical trial phase? I guess my answer is really yes. To do what I described as a lot of work, yes, but you do know that the environment is going to change. You can say this is how things look now, but I do know they might change, and to ignore the possibility of that change, I think would be wouldn't help. It would help not to ignore it. I'll put it the positive way. But of course, you don't know exactly how it is going to change. And like I said, I personally think it is still very important that you do some type of activity, even if you're intending to do that exit, because whoever wants to come in and buy you out or license you, they still will want to know, is this going to meet the demand when it gets to market, which is why they are buying it and licensing it. And so they would want to know what you have done to be sure that what you've developed from your idea start to this point in the clinical trial, when that product is now fixed at that point, what did you take into consideration? I think that would be the smart thing to do, but I appreciate it's not easy to do. Nicholas.
You addressed the issue of competitor product. I think that's really important, especially to do time to a big pharma also chasing pretty similar. But along those lines, I was interested whether you considered changing company environment. So you could be licensing to a company and they change their mind. And it's happened within companies, I'm sure. So is that something that you can factor in, or
well, for you as a company who might have your product licensed, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to factor in all of these things about change of environment or strategic decisions within a company, whether they're, especially if they're a big company, because there's so many different disease areas that are getting balanced out. So it's hard to try and forecast that part of it. And I would come back to saying focus on what it is you're trying to do, but keeping an eye on, okay, we know this is what it is now, but what is coming up in the future? Now, you mentioned competitor products. There it's usually maybe a little bit easier to get a handle on what is being done. Not always, of course. But if there are clinical trials, then you might have some idea of, from data being presented, how they're looking. You can get a feel for, am I going in the same direction? Am I going to be best in class or first in class? And these are both important considerations. The amount of potential value can drop if you're not best or first, but there can still be significant room. The example for me is with the statins, where the one that AstraZeneca released, Crestor, that was number 7 on the market, but still made a pretty big impact because it was able to differentiate from the competitor. So yeah, it's I don't know if actually if any of my, either Philip or Liz would have any comment there. The question was about considering future change within the climate of a company that is going to be licensing your product, and to what extent you can take that possibility for change into account, and then a sort of related question around competitor products.
I don't know that I can address that question directly, but one thing that does occur to me is there's a company called BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and they used to have a saying that if you're in the lamp business and 90% of making a lamp is bending metal, you don't worry just about the other people who are in the lamp business, but you worry about the other people who know how to bend metal, because they could be your competitors. And in healthcare, that sometimes plays out. That people who are in the catheter business know how to use silicone and manufacture silicone products. And there are instances where they've actually then gone on to make implantable devices that are not catheters because they knew how to make this stuff. And so you have to look not just within your industry, but you have to look a little further down. And say, you know, are there other competitors out there who come along and disrupt my business who may not be in my business? Yeah. My favorite example, and it was all within Pfizer. Pfizer bought a urology business that made penile implants for impotence. And it was a very good business for them. And then along came in their labs, same company, Viagra. And Viagra kind of put that business out of business. And I'm sure the people who were running that medical device business never thought that the drug industry was going to obviate their business. So just don't just look within what it is that you do, but you have to look at a broader window and say, who else could fix this problem, maybe with a different technology or a different approach than I am.
Very good points, Philip. Lisa, nothing in the chat?
Not at this time, no. It's a little quiet.
Okay.
Look, I think I think it was Nicholas's question. It's hard to anticipate what a future buyer might have going on, and how that might impact their desirability, their desire to acquire you. You know, they keep what's in research very closely private. You know.
Yep. Some things are just too hard
There's
to
no
believe.
magic.
I see a hand up in, I think with Liz Pyle.
Yes, we have a question here. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Excellent. So great presentation, Willie. Thanks so much for sharing this knowledge with us. My question is, can you share some of the most, over your time doing this customer discovery, with others, some of the most fascinating or interesting surprises that folks found out during the customer discovery process? And that question could also be open to others who have engaged in the customer discovery process themselves today.
well, I think actually one of, I have to say it wasn't personally a surprise to me, but it was around this, one of the companies that was looking at a particular type of oncology, and when they did start out with the view, well, it's not really going to be a surprise, but once they very quickly came to a point that they were finding out that their assumption that their product was going to be relatively easy to use and that it would be attractive because it was going to, in their view, extend life, was actually not what the clinicians that would, and the neurosurgeons that would be doing this, it wasn't what they thought they would be comfortable with. And so that was a big pivot for them. And there was actually quite differently, but one of the other companies that's around an app to do with wellness of women around the menopause time. And there was actually, that was really fun, very energetic, very enthusiastic lady that is the founder of that company. And through the customer discovery activity had come up with actually quite a different customer segment, a much, actually surprisingly a bit a younger customer segment that was going to be one to go for. So it was, the fun part comes when, to my mind, when the clients that we interact with, when they go through the customer discovery process and you can see the light in their eyes lighting up, that they get it. They see the value of doing it. That's really, it's really enjoyable when that happens, because they gain a whole nother level of energy to explore more, to get the right match of, what they were thinking of doing, but now to get the right match to the problem, and some clearer line towards the value. So I'm not sure if that answers you fully, Amy, but that's where I am at the moment.
Thank you.
Well, I have an example to give you. One of our mentees developed a device to measure respiration in a hospital. So patients, is their respiration deteriorating, and being able to know early on if they're deteriorating or not is an important predictor. And then he went out and did due diligence and customer discovery and spoke, among other things, to the parents of some asthmatic children. And he discovered that really the hair on fire problem was not in the clinic or in the hospital, but at home, where the patient or the parent is trying to figure out, my son is having a problem breathing. Is this just a passing issue, or are they getting worse? And when do I have to intervene? And that turned out to be a much more hair on fire kind of problem. And so he pivoted from having a clinical product to having an at-home patient product or parent product. And I don't think he would have ever figured that out, that there was, and it's not that there wasn't a need in the clinical environment, it's that there was a bigger need and a more of a hair on fire problem at home. And so he pivoted.
Another great example. Okay. sorry, Lisa, I was just thinking still, I guess there's probably not much more in the chat. So,
Yeah, we're not seeing a whole lot here. I know that we have people in several of the locations. Like, do we want to ask, maybe Heather in Roanoke? Maybe there's a person there who has a question, or I know Amy asked there in Manassas. Any other questions? Anyone online? I actually like seeing the people have their camera on. Thank you, Erica. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap things up? So for the folks that are in person, there is a mentor present to answer any questions that you have. So for the people who are in Manassas, Liz will be able to ask or answer any questions that you have. Philip is here online to ask any questions. I dropped the link again to ICAP. Any of the mentors are welcome to share their information or their LinkedIn profiles or anything if they would like to field questions offline. I'll leave that to you.
okay.
Anything before we conclude? Philip, any final words?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody that turned up, either online or in person, and thank you for listening to this presentation and also for the questions that we did get.
Oh, yeah. And there was a really great question about where it was going to be posted. So the ICAP website has a public outsourcing resources page. So that will be uploaded there as well. In case you happen to have missed Philip's presentation about funding, that replay and his PowerPoint deck is uploaded there. So if for some reason, I know William mentioned it at the beginning of his presentation, if you'd like to review that replay, it's absolutely there for your review. Anything else? Okay. I guess we'll call it a wrap.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Everybody for being here. Thank you, William.
Right.
Thanks, William.
Liz,
Right. Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Liz. Amy. Thanks, Lisa.
you're very welcome.